The barbed wire, a cruel embroidery against the winter sky, held more than just bodies. It contained a soul-sickening tedium. Death, a constant companion in this bleak domain, had become commonplace. Its grim face no longer elicited fear, but rather a chilling indifference. Within the ranks of the custodians, the SS, a new horror was brewing, born not of necessity, but of languor. They sought respite from the monotony, not in compassion, but in the orchestration of cruelty, their black uniforms concealing hearts as frost-bitten as the earth beneath their boots. They were not seeking to improve efficiency. They were looking to entertain themselves with a new kind of game, each play more horrible than the one before, each play more disturbing, a brutal ballet performed on a stage of ice and despair. Obedience here was absolute, a terrifying silence broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and the anguished cries that were now as much a part of the soundscape as the wind whistling through the watchtowers. They could never be safe, they knew that. All they could hope for was a quick and relatively painless death, something most of them would not receive. Death was to be a cruel and prolonged experience, designed to entertain their captors. Their life here was not a life at all. It was a cruel spectacle, a circus of despair with the SS men as ringmasters and the prisoners as the unwilling clowns. The system needed to be better, it demanded to be better, but it was not. It never would be. The evil had set in, and it would not be undone. This was a place where hope came to die, where even the strongest spirits were eventually crushed under the weight of the overwhelming brutality. The stories the prisoners tell each other are growing more and more horrifying, and they know that the world outside will not believe what they have seen, what they have experienced, the sheer madness of what occurs within these walls. The guards are, more often than not, insane, and yet this is normal, this is expected, and this is accepted. There is no escape. The only respite is in death, which for many is a sweet release from the horrors they have seen. The system needed to be broken, but by who? No one knows. All they know is the pain, the suffering, and the sheer unending despair that has become their life. The air itself seemed to crackle with the anticipation of cruelty, the very silence punctuated by the unspoken dread of what the next hour, the next minute might bring. What new depravity would be conjured from the minds of these men who held power over life and death, who saw in their captives not fellow human beings, but mere playthings, objects to be manipulated, broken, and discarded at whim? The guards had so much power, it corrupted them beyond repair. They are no longer human. They are monsters, beasts, with a singular desire to cause pain and suffering. How long can this go on? How long can they continue to endure such cruelty? Each day is a new test of their humanity. Each day they must fight to hold on to what little remains of their souls. The stories they share, the songs they whisper, are the only weapons they have against the encroaching darkness. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the camp lay shrouded in an uneasy stillness, they could almost convince themselves that it was all a nightmare, a terrible hallucination from which they would soon awaken. But then the cold reality would seep in, the gnawing hunger, the aching bones, the ever-present fear, and they knew that there would be no awakening. This was their world now, and they were trapped within its icy grip. These were not punishments meted out for transgressions, breaches of the camp's draconian rules, nor were they interrogations, attempts to extract information from unwilling sources. Such actions, while brutal, served a purpose, however twisted. No, these were displays, spectacles staged solely for the entertainment of the guards, elaborate charades with arbitrary rules, meaningless objectives, and uniformly lethal consequences. A dance of death, choreographed by sadists, performed by skeletons. There was no rhyme or reason to it, no logic, only the perverse delight of watching human beings reduced to their most primal state, stripped of dignity, of hope, of everything that made them human. The prisoners, they tried to ignore it. They try to shield their eyes from the horrors, but they cannot. They are forced to watch, to participate, to become complicit in their own degradation. And in that complicity, something dies within them, something vital, something that can never be recovered. The guards, they revel in it. They bask in the power they wield, the control they exert. They laugh, they jeer, they place bets, as if this were nothing more than a sporting event, a harmless game. But there is nothing harmless about it, nothing innocent. It is pure, unadulterated evil, a stain on humanity that can never be fully erased. They were testing them to see just how far they could be pushed before they broke, before they screamed, before they died. The prisoners knew that any show of defiance would be met with swift and brutal reprisal, but to simply accept their fate, to passively submit to the will of their captors, was its own form of death, a slow, agonizing erosion of the spirit. So they walked a tightrope, balancing on the edge of despair, trying to find some way to survive, some way to hold on to their sanity in the face of such overwhelming madness. The air was thick with the stench of fear, of sweat, of despair, a suffocating miasma that clung to the skin and permeated the soul. Even the silence seemed to scream, a cacophony of unspoken horrors that echoed through the barracks and haunted their dreams. Winter, with its icy grip and paralyzing snow, offered a brief respite from the relentless toil, yet it also bred a new kind of torment. The guards, denied their usual outlet for cruelty and forced labour, sought alternative diversions, ways to alleviate the boredom that gnawed at them like a hungry beast. Not all were desk-bound bureaucrats, content with paperwork and regulations. Many were young, hardened by war, indoctrinated with ideology, their souls scarred by the brutality of the front lines and emboldened by the impunity afforded by their uniforms. The war has ended, so now they turn to the prisoners for entertainment, seeking new and creative ways to inflict pain and suffering. They are the lost boys corrupted by violence, unable to find solace in anything other than cruelty. They have lost their humanity, their compassion, and their souls are as black as the uniforms they wear. The cold seeps into their bones, numbing their senses, making it harder to resist, harder to hold on to hope. The prisoners feel themselves growing weaker, their bodies betraying them, their spirits flagging. But they must fight. They must resist. They must hold on to the belief that somehow, someday, they will be free. For in that belief, however fragile, lay their only chance of survival. The guards watched them, their eyes glinting with anticipation, waiting for them to break, waiting for them to scream, waiting for them to die. Some guards, seeking entertainment that transcended mere beatings, organised physical competitions among the prisoners. Stripped naked, forced to run across the frozen mud or directly on the unforgiving snow, they became unwilling athletes in a macabre spectacle. The guards, huddled in their warm coats, placed bets, shouted contradictory orders, their laughter echoing across the desolate landscape, as if this were a sporting event, a test of skill, rather than a brutal display of human suffering. The humiliation was as piercing as the cold, each gust of wind a reminder of their vulnerability, their nakedness exposed not only to the elements, but also to the jeering eyes of their tormentors. It was a desperate fight for survival, a test of endurance that few could pass. The ice cuts into their bare feet, the wind whips at their exposed skin, and their lungs burn with each desperate gasp for air. But they keep running, driven by the primal instinct to survive, to outlast their tormentors, to prove that they are not yet broken. When one fell, collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and despair, they were met not with mercy, but with kicks, with blows, until they were either dead or dragged back to their barracks, barely breathing, their bodies broken, their spirits crushed. The air grew thick with the stench of fear, of sweat, of despair, a suffocating miasma that clung to the skin and permeated the soul. Even the silence seemed to scream, a cacophony of unspoken horrors that echoed through the barracks and haunted their dreams. They are never alone, never at peace. The spectre of death hovers over them, a constant reminder of their mortality. These games were not dictated by regulations, not part of any established routine. They arose spontaneously, eruptions of twisted energy from those who lived in a system where they could do anything at all without consequence. They had the power of life and death. They could kill at any time, and there would be no repercussions. How can they possibly understand? They don't understand what it's like to live in a world where your life is not your own, where every breath is a gift and every day is a struggle. Sometimes, groups of inmates were forced to form impromptu theatre troupes, compelled to perform degrading plays, each scene more humiliating than the last. Those of Jewish heritage were forced to parody their own faith, communists to deliver ridiculous speeches, homosexuals to dance amidst the guards' drunken laughter. It was a mockery of humanity, a grotesque display of power that served only to reinforce the guards' sense of superiority. The prisoners, they try to resist, they try to hold on to their dignity, but it is a losing battle. They are forced to humiliate themselves, to debase themselves, to become objects of ridicule and scorn. The laughter of the guards rings in their ears, a constant reminder of their powerlessness. They yearn for death, for an end to the suffering, for a release from the torment. But even death is denied them. They must continue to endure, to suffer, to be humiliated until their bodies finally give out. These were not just acts of cruelty. They were deliberate attempts to break the spirit, to strip away the last vestiges of hope, to reduce human beings to nothing more than animals, cowering in fear. The prisoners feel themselves growing weaker, their bodies betraying them, their spirits flagging. But they must fight. They must resist. They must hold on to the belief that somehow, someday, they will be free. For in that belief, however fragile, lay their only chance of survival. The same guards who had previously fired shots, supervised executions, now roared with laughter, bottles in hand, watching shows staged with bodies trembling from fear and cold. The contrast was jarring, the juxtaposition of violence and merriment deeply disturbing. It was a demonstration of the guards' complete detachment from the suffering they inflicted, a chilling display of their moral bankruptcy. One of the most common games involved forcing the prisoners to sing, but not just any song. They were compelled to belt out Nazi hymns, German folk songs, military marches, while marching in circles or enduring beatings. The guards, they revel in it. They bask in the power they wield, the control they exert. They laugh, they jeer, they place bets, as if this were nothing more than a sporting event, a harmless game. But there is nothing harmless about it, nothing innocent. It is pure, unadulterated evil, a stain on humanity that can never be fully erased. If someone sang out of tune, or if their voice was weak, the punishment was immediate. The music serves as a tool of torture, a weapon wielded by the guards, to inflict pain and suffering. The prisoners, they try to sing, they try to find some semblance of harmony, but their voices are weak, their spirits broken. They are forced to sing songs of hate, songs of violence, songs that celebrate the very ideology that has led to their imprisonment. Some more sadistic guards, spotting a particularly frail prisoner, would order them to sing alone, as if it were a recital. Sometimes they were given a cap or a cane, forced to dance, and when their body could no longer respond, they were all beaten. They push them to the limit, to see just how far they can be pushed before they break, before they scream, before they die. The prisoners knew that any show of defiance would be met with swift and brutal reprisal, but to simply accept their fate, to passively submit to the will of their captors, was its own form of death, a slow, agonizing erosion of the spirit. So they walked a tightrope, balancing on the edge of despair, trying to find some way to survive, some way to hold on to their sanity in the face of such overwhelming madness. It was not an interrogation, not an execution. It was entertainment. Strength games were also part of the repertoire of cruelty. Groups of 3 or 4 prisoners were forced to push each other, lift stones, carry comrades on their shoulders, or maintain uncomfortable postures for hours like living statues. The one who fell first was beaten, a brutal reminder of their weakness, their vulnerability. The guards, they revel in it. They bask in the power they wield, the control they exert. They laugh, they jeer, they place bets, as if this were nothing more than a sporting event, a harmless game. But there is nothing harmless about it, nothing innocent. It is pure, unadulterated evil, a stain on humanity that can never be fully erased. The one who lasted longer was forced to repeat it, a cruel and pointless cycle of exertion designed to break their bodies and their spirits. They push them to the limit to see just how far they can be pushed before they break, before they scream, before they die. The prisoners knew that any show of defiance would be met with swift and brutal reprisal, but to simply accept their fate, to passively submit to the will of their captors, was its own form of death, a slow, agonizing erosion of the spirit. So they walked a tightrope, balancing on the edge of despair, trying to find some way to survive, some way to hold on to their sanity in the face of such overwhelming madness. Sometimes they were forced to dig holes and then fill them back in, over and over again. The goal was not to create a pit or move useful soil. It was to observe the desperation, the futility, the slow erosion of hope. The futility of it all weighs heavily on their shoulders, crushing their spirits and making it harder to resist the encroaching darkness. They feel themselves growing weaker, their bodies betraying them, their spirits flagging. But they must fight. They must resist. They must hold on to the belief that somehow, someday, they will be free. For in that belief, however fragile, lay their only chance of survival. The prisoners see the hopelessness. They see that their captors do not care about them. They do not care if they live or die. To them, they are nothing more than animals, objects to be used and discarded at whim. Cigarettes or bottles were wagered on how long each one would last before collapsing, a testament to the guards' dehumanization, their utter lack of empathy. It seems to be that they are not even people anymore, but commodities, objects to be bought and sold, used and discarded at the whim of their captors. They have lost everything, their families, their homes, their freedom, their dignity. All that remains is the will to survive. They cling to each other, offering comfort and support, sharing stories of their past lives, dreaming of a future that seems increasingly impossible. The officers who participated knew perfectly well that these men were hungry, sick, wounded, but that only made the game more interesting. It was a terrible game that has taken so many lives, so many spirits, and their captors still laugh, still jeer, and still believe they are superior. They revel in the suffering they inflict, and they seem to take pleasure in the pain and torment of others. How can they be so heartless? How can they be so cruel? It was about witnessing the exact moment the body gave out, the point of no return, the final surrender. Sometimes there are acts of kindness, glimmers of hope in the midst of the darkness. A guard who secretly slips them a piece of bread, a doctor who provides them with extra medication, a fellow prisoner who offers them a word of encouragement. These small acts of compassion are like beacons in the night, reminding them that even in the darkest of places there is still light to be found. Sadism combined with routine in absurd exercises repeated for hours, a soul-crushing monotony that served only to reinforce their captivity, their powerlessness. A dance of death, choreographed by sadists, performed by skeletons. There was no rhyme or reason to it, no logic, only the perverse delight of watching human beings reduced to their most primal state, stripped of dignity, of hope, of everything that made them human. The prisoners, they try to ignore it. They try to shield their eyes from the horrors, but they cannot. They are forced to watch, to participate, to become complicit in their own degradation. And in that complicity, something dies within them, something vital, something that can never be recovered. There was a game that consisted of making the prisoners jump like frogs across the yard from one end to the other, without being allowed to stand up or stop. What are they fighting for? What are they hoping for? Do they even believe that they will ever be free again? Another involved throwing objects into the mud and forcing the prisoners to retrieve them with their mouths. Occasionally real food was placed among the trash as a form of mockery, a cruel tease designed to provoke desperation and reward it with punishment. It is a cruel world, and the guards seem intent on making it even crueler. They revel in the suffering of others, and they seem to take pleasure in the pain and torment of those they have captured. Their actions are not those of men, but of beasts, and the only thing that separates them from the prisoners is the power they wield. Those who rushed to grab the food were beaten, a swift and brutal reminder of their place in the hierarchy, their utter lack of control over their own fate. Sometimes there are acts of kindness, glimmers of hope in the midst of the darkness. A guard who secretly slips them a piece of bread, a doctor who provides them with extra medication, a fellow prisoner who offers them a word of encouragement. These small acts of compassion are like beacons in the night, reminding them that even in the darkest of places there is still light to be found. There were no written rules, no guidelines to follow. The only constant was humiliation, a relentless assault on their dignity, their humanity. Sometimes the guards involved the capos, or privileged prisoners, those who had earned a modicum of power by collaborating with the SS. They were put in charge of executing the logistics of the game, choosing the weakest, pushing them forward, keeping the line orderly, selecting who would sing, who would run, who would dance. It seems that evil can corrupt anyone, and that even those who have suffered the most can be capable of inflicting pain on others. They are simply trying to survive, to protect themselves, and to make their lives a little easier. But in doing so, they are perpetuating the cycle of violence, and they are contributing to the suffering of their fellow prisoners. This allowed the SS officers to maintain some distance, watching from the background with their arms crossed, as if they were judges of a grotesque show. From that position, they commented, laughed, evaluated who seemed most broken, who cried first, who rebelled. And it appears that all humanity has died, and they are no longer capable of feeling any empathy, any compassion, or any remorse. Their hearts have been hardened by the violence they have witnessed, and they have become numb to the suffering of others. What will become of the prisoners? Will they ever be free? What will they do if they are released? How can they possibly return to a normal life after experiencing such horrors? If anyone raised their voice, the game ended in a public execution, a stark reminder of the consequences of defiance, and the others returned to their places, trembling, their spirits further broken. Macabre humour was ever present, a twisted form of entertainment that served only to highlight the guards' depravity, their utter disregard for human life. Sometimes they staged fictitious trials where one prisoner had to act as judge and another as the accused, charged with stealing a potato or conspiring against the Reich. The rest of the group had to act as the jury and deliver verdicts which were always guilty. It seems that justice has died, and there is no longer any hope of fairness or of mercy. The prisoners can only look on in horror, knowing that they are powerless to intervene, powerless to save their fellow prisoners. They are forced to watch as the guards make a mockery of the law, a mockery of justice, and a mockery of humanity. In the end, a ridiculous sentence was read, and an execution was simulated, which more than once ended up being real. What can be done? How can the prisoners possibly endure such treatment? How can they possibly hold on to their sanity in the face of such overwhelming cruelty? The line between parody and death was thin, almost imperceptible. and the prisoners never knew if they would come out of one of those games alive. There is only death and despair. It seems to be that evil has triumphed, and there is no longer any hope of good in the world. The prisoners can only cling to each other, offering comfort and support, and sharing stories of their past lives, and dreaming of a future that seems increasingly impossible. In other cases, the guards played among themselves, betting how many prisoners could die of cold during a night if they were left naked in the open, or if they could cross the camp running between 2 rows of armed soldiers without being shot. It was a macabre sport, not made for camp control, but to break the prisoner's spirit and amuse the jailer. The spectacle continues, as the guards are more cruel and creative in their torture methods, with no end in sight for the prisoners. It seems that only a miracle can save them now. There was no other logic. The rules were improvised according to the mood of the officer on duty. The only constant was dehumanization, a relentless assault on their dignity, their humanity. Sometimes even guards from other camps were invited, as if they were special performances, like critics attending a particularly gruesome play. One might think that this would have satiated the guards' desire for torture and torment, but there was no end in sight for the prisoners. The funniest prisoners, the thinnest, or the clumsiest, were saved for these occasions. They were displayed as clowns, given ridiculous hats, torn uniforms, made to sing and dance in front of an audience that laughed while eating. These events were sometimes called camp cabarets, although there was no music or stage, only exhausted bodies trembling with fear, trying to survive one more day. A grim spectacle, but the show must go on. The guards applauded, some took photographs, others wrote down names for the next performance, an unending cycle of cruelty, a testament to the depths of human depravity. Only one can hope and pray that the end of this cycle is on the horizon for the prisoners,